In this last segment, we'll look at what Aristotle's positive theory is and the grounds on which he holds it. Perhaps his core idea is that our chief good is determined by our function, and that our function is determined by our nature. It's determined by what sort of entity, what sort of animal we are. Just as every man-made object has a function, so every natural thing has a function, that is, a characteristic activity towards which all of its parts and powers are directed. It is a good thing of that sort insofar as it performs that characteristic activity or function well. What is a good fork? A good fork is one which is able to poke food, which is sturdy enough to lift a bite of food to your mouth. That's about it. That's what a good fork is. The function of a fork is to be able to spear food and move it. What's a good knife? The function of a knife is to cut meat or paper or boxes, depending on the kind of knife. So a knife is a good knife just to the extent that it is able to perform that function of cutting something. Similarly, if you consider a natural object, say a lion too has a nature, and a lion has a natural function. The natural function isn't any simple activity like cutting or spearing food. The function of a lion is to live a lion's type of life, to be able to hunt and eat, to sleep during the day, be lazy like all cats, to reproduce, to live that typical lion's sort of life. That's the function of a lion. And a lion is a good example of a lion insofar as it is able to carry out that function. Aristotle seems to think, like Plato, that the function of a thing is what it only does or what it best does. Or consider a little tomato plant. What's the function of a tomato plant? It is to grow, to put out leaves, to put out fruits that have seeds. That's the function of a tomato plant, and it's not really relevant what one desires. It may be that you desire a tomato plant which is wimpy and wilted and yellow and which doesn't bear any fruit. Well, maybe that's what you want, but given the nature of a tomato plant, its function is already set by that. It's not determined by what this or that person thinks. In a sense, a nature is an objective thing, and so a thing's natural function is an objective matter as well. What is it then that a human being only or best does? Aristotle would say that the answer is reasoning. The unique capacity of a human being is, we could say, rationality. The ability to gather evidence, the ability to distinguish the true from the false, the ability to construct theories, to do mathematics, to philosophize. In some sense, other animals have minds. Yes, your dog can reason, your dog can tell that you're displeased with him and so on. He can tell when it's time to go for a walk, but he's not able to do mathematics or construct sophisticated theories or really weigh evidence or ask philosophical questions. The ancient Greeks assume reasonably that human beings are the only rational animal in the full-blown sense of rationality. So if that's our natural function, is reasoning, that type of higher mental functioning, then a person is a complete, good, or flourishing person to the degree that they are living up to this natural standard, fulfilling their nature, fulfilling their human nature. On Aristotle's view, this explains why Plato is right that our rational desires, that is, the reasoning part of the soul, should dominate, and why we won't truly flourish if the other parts of us dominate. On Aristotle's view, we are failing to live up to our nature if we are being ruled over by our feelings or our bodily desires. This is why Aristotle rejects the view that what counts as happiness or what constitutes happiness is very different from person to person, or that we can define what happiness consists in, or that happiness is just whatever you think it is, and things like that. We don't control our nature. We don't control what kind of creatures we are. Whether we're flourishing or not depends on whether we're able to perform our natural function. Our natural function is determined by our nature. And this is why it's ridiculous to say that the DT diet, the donuts and tequila diet, is a healthy diet. It doesn't matter if anybody wants that sort of diet or if anybody thinks that's a healthy diet. We all know that it's not a healthy diet, and it just can't be a healthy diet for a human being because of human nature, because we could say of how human beings are put together. Again, you might think that 2 hours of sleep is best. Look, people do vary a little bit on how much sleep they can thrive on. Some people seem to need 10 hours. Some people seem to only need 4 or 5 hours. Probably no human being can really thrive and function well and be healthy on 2 hours of sleep per night. So human nature allows for some variation in what's healthy for us, but there are absolute boundaries there. Aristotle's theory then amounts to this, at least his theory as presented in Book 1 of the Nichomachean Ethics. This is my own paraphrase, and I've put each element of it on a separate line just to help you see how complicated it is. A happy life is, first of all, a complete life. A life can only be happy or not judged in its totality. We're not talking about just how one is doing or even feeling at a particular moment. A happy life has to be a life of activity. It has to be a life of doing things. It can't just be a passive condition, even a condition like being perfectly virtuous. It has to be a life of activity, and not just any kind of activity, but activity in accordance with our rational nature. He would say activity in accordance with moral and intellectual virtue or skill. But that's not enough. There are external goods, things beyond your own mind and body, which you also need to truly flourish and thrive. Things like friendship, food, shelter, peacetime, enough money, even enough leisure time. On Aristotle's theory, having a well-ordered soul or mind is required for happiness, but doesn't by itself guarantee happiness, as against his teacher Plato. Aristotle observes that this theory fits well with what people commonly say and think about happiness. So now that he's fully formulated the theory, he goes back and reconsiders common sense. People say that one who is happy lives well and does well. Check. People say happiness involves virtue or skill. Check. Happiness is pleasant in itself. Check. This is going to involve pleasure. It's going to involve the pleasure of eating and drinking and exploring and learning, friendship and things like that. People say that happiness is the best, finest, and most pleasant condition. Seems pretty plausible, seems pretty complete. And people say that happiness needs external goods, and that certain kinds of external losses can deprive one of happiness. So people say that happiness requires good fortune. So if you're struck dead at a young age, if everybody that knows you betrays you, leaves you friendless, if you're robbed blind and you die in poverty on the street, you might say, well, through no fault of your own, you've been deprived of a fully happy life by those kinds of things. So whether or not you're happy doesn't seem to be completely under your control, if Aristotle is right. So as I understand Aristotle, that's what he says about happiness in Book 1 of the Nichomachean Ethics. Later on in the book, in Book 10, Aristotle says some surprising things about happiness. Well, maybe they shouldn't completely surprise us. There's a famous opening to one of his other books called Metaphysics. Right at the start of the book, he says, "All men by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses. Above all others, the sense of sight. For not only with a view to action, but even when we are not going to do anything, we prefer seeing, one might say, to everything else. The reason is that this, most of all the senses, makes us know, and brings to light many differences between things." The quote to remember from this is this famous one, "All men by nature desire to know." He thinks human beings are rational animals, that we have a natural hunger and thirst for knowledge, and that when we engage in the quest for knowledge, we're really at least trying to live up to our human nature. But what he says in Book 10 of the Nichomachean Ethics goes far beyond this. He basically praises a life of study, or it could be translated contemplation. And you shouldn't think when you read that study like in school, doing worksheets, doing your reading assignments, writing papers and stuff like that. In Aristotle's day, they didn't really have those institutions. He's thinking more about the type of study that you would engage in if you were a man of leisure. If you were somebody that had your needs provided for and you could be sort of a Renaissance person and just indulge yourself in investigating the fascinating world in which we live. He even says that a happy life is a life of contemplation. And he rattles off a big list of features of study or contemplation which qualify this to be, it looks like, our chief good. He says it's the most continuous activity. In other words, that the mind can always be engaged and active. That it's a pure and firm pleasure. It's consistently enjoyable, and it's not mixed with pain. It's hard to see how that's true, by the way. Sometimes the quest for knowledge involves a lot of pain. Thirdly, it involves being self-sufficient, something one can do on one's own. Again, that's questionable if you think about the way science is done. Fourth, study is liked solely because of itself, he says, and aims at no end apart from itself. Really? There are a lot of practical ends for which we want knowledge and understanding. He says that it involves leisure and unwearied activity. It makes a life divine, godlike. It makes one beloved by the gods. Really? He says this is the sort of life most properly ours, as we are our understanding. And this explains why animals can't be happy, at least not happy in the way that humans are happy, because they cannot engage in contemplation, because they are not intellectual creatures like we are. And he says that this seems to be the best condition. So after all this praise for study and contemplation, he says, hence a human being's complete happiness will be this activity if it receives a complete span of life. What? This sounds really out of whack. It sounds like a theory that only a professor could love, sort of a Poindexter intellectual theory. Granted that this is a central and important part of human nature, to have knowledge, to use our reasoning powers. But it just seems too simple and out of whack to say that a happy life is a life of study or contemplation. Didn't we just see in Book 1 that there are many facets to a happy life that requires activity and all kinds of different external goods? So one can object to this theory presented in Book 10 that it looks like it's hopelessly unbalanced and just pathologically intellectual. So we have an apparent conflict. There's what he presents in Book 1, which is this complicated and you might say well-rounded view about what human flourishing consists in. Then there's this very intellectual statement in Book 10. What's going on here? It could be that these just are not consistent. Maybe Aristotle changed his mind. Maybe he was starting with common sense in Book 1, but ultimately he rejects that at the end of the book. Then again, you might think that the views can be harmonized, that there is a way to understand them as fitting together. So to the objection I just gave, why can't Aristotle reply that any happy life, any flourishing life for any human must involve some study? Study using your mental powers has to be a central strand to a happy life. But perhaps for many people, or for most people, it won't be the dominant element in a happy life. Consider the man on the right. This is a professor lecturing. Maybe it's obvious that for him to flourish and thrive will involve centrally a lot of intellectual activity, a lot of study or contemplation. The guy on the left, he delivers packages, and that's not all he does. That's not all there is to his life. He studies on the side. Maybe he likes to learn about Civil War history or biology, or maybe he doesn't study in any academic sense, but is rather a student of human nature. Maybe he's engaging his mind in finding out what it is to be the best father, husband, friend he can be. If he's really happy, if he's really thriving, then he too will be engaged in study or contemplation, just not to the same extent that the guy on the right will be. So I'm suggesting that maybe there's some relativity to individual persons. Maybe things are a bit different with respect to different persons and how much they have to be involved in study or contemplation to live a thriving life. My suggestion then is that Aristotle is not inconsistent, that what he says in Book 1 and what he says in Book 10 can be harmonized together in the way that I just suggested.